Sorry, yes, I've pressed the button. I was on mute.
Oh, right, okay.
I was behaving myself.
Okay, and then I believe you can all see my screen and the slides. Right, Simon, would you like to kick off?
Right, here we go. So welcome to a Community Planning Alliance webinar on the topic of how to fight an unsuitable garden community. Some people will understand what that means, others won't. The majority of people will be using garden community in completely the wrong context, and that's a question I'll move on to with Rosie and Richard later. My name is Simon Thomas. I'm a campaigner. I'm an ex-parish councillor. I still work. I'm a businessman, but I have a very deep wish for the government to amend the way in which it's planning at the moment in terms of housing, farmland, the environment, etc. So I am 100% a supporter of what Rosie, Marge, Caroline, Rebecca, community of ours, which is a community of campaigners with over, I think, 570 now, Rosie?
590.
590, brilliant. So what I'm going to do today is I'm not going to speak very much, but I'm going to ask incredibly difficult and probing questions, which Richard and Rosie, who will just introduce themselves in a second, will answer. The reason it's them here is that they have actually campaigned successfully against garden communities. And so it's very important to listen to what has actually happened and what happens in the real world, both to set expectations, but also to give people a lot of ideas of what you can do. So first of all, can I ask Rosie, just you to very briefly introduce yourself, please?
Yes, so hello everyone. I think most of you probably know me by now. You've heard of me drone on previously. I'm the chairman of the Community Planning Alliance, and I run a local group called the Better Braintree Together group, which is for people interested in planning the environment in the district. And I previously fought off one of the biggest garden communities in the country, 24,000 home West Tay, which was part of the North Essex garden communities that I'll tell you about in a bit.
Thank you, Rosie. And then we're very, very pleased to have Richard here today with us. Richard, you are a councillor. You were on a planning committee, but I don't think you are any longer. Perhaps you could introduce yourself to everybody and just very briefly explain what's happened in the last 48 hours.
Yes, hello everybody. Richard Pavitt. I live in Great Chesterford, which is the most northerly arm of Essex, right on the Cambridgeshire border, in the district of Uttlesford. Dating back to 2017, I was little more than an angry resident, and I was co-opted or asked to, by virtue of my background, which is in press relations and public relations and TV and so forth, by virtue of that, I was asked to lead a campaign group against a garden community that was very suddenly imposed. It came from nowhere. It wasn't flagged. We knew nothing about it until it was suddenly dumped into the local plan, a matter of 5 or 6 months before it came to public consultation. So we fought this, and we fought hard, and I say we won. We won in as much as when the inspectors finally reviewed the plan, they said that the component in the plan, which was our garden community, didn't stand the test, and therefore the entire plan failed. By virtue of that, I got kind of politicized a bit wound up about the behavior of district councils. So I stood along with a colleague a couple of doors down from me who was a parish councillor. We stood, we won emphatically against a very strong conservative contingent in this area. It's been blue since the year dot. And one of the first things I did was to join the planning committee. I mean, I'd always felt that the best way to have persuasion is to have your feet under the table and be, nose to nose, face to face with those people who you might want to argue with. And it's been a very interesting experience and a very gratifying one until yesterday, when, as a consequence of the fact that we do not have a 5-year land supply, and we do not have a local plan, or not a current one, our local plan dates from 2005, we, are under a great deal of pressure from speculative development from all around our district. And we were last month placed into special measures by the Department for Levelling Up Communities and Local Government. I think that's what they call themselves now, unjustifiably. And one of the things you have to bear in mind is that in 2019, this district became under the control of a residents' party, an independent residents' party, and emphatically so. I mean, they absolutely trounced the ruling Conservative group. And there was quite a few bloody noses, and obviously quite a few out of joint noses in the Conservative Party. And I suspect that we'll be making an object case of. We're being slapped down and told to behave, and we're on the naughty step. Because I also understand that there could be as many as 50 who face the same, or could face the same kind of censure from the ministry, but haven't.
Sorry, Richard, just to be clear, that's 50 local planning authorities, not individual councillors.
No, 50 local planning authorities is my understanding. That was what Housing Magazine suggested would be the likely number. So the question still remains, is why just Uttlesford? However, I leave that out there. But yesterday it all got rather heated. We had an application for 124 houses come before us. Literally, just I can almost see the site from my window. And we were hijacked. The committee was frankly hijacked. We were bounced into making a decision under threat of this, that, and the other. And I felt there was little point in my being on the committee anymore. So I resigned there and then. I have to say, since then, in the past 24 hours, a great deal of proverbial poo has hit the proverbial fan. And we wait to see whether there's going to be a judicial review of the procedure, or at the very least, a scrutiny committee review of the procedure. And in the meantime, myself and my co-councillor have asked that the decision notice is withheld.
Fantastic, Richard. And I think what that just summarises for us, both in Rosie and Richard, we've got two, not just campaigners, but successful activists who are taking action. And I think that's one of the things I want to try and focus on today with you both, is as per the agenda that is currently being shown. Very briefly, we'll talk about a garden community, and I'll ask you questions and tell you what I think, and then get what you want to tell us. Then we'll talk about Rosie and her experiences in North Essex. Then Richard, a lot more about what's been going on in Uttlesford, and then we'd like to break that into a very general discussion, really trying to focus on three things. What would they have done differently, knowing what they now know now? How do they keep the planning focus in a group and don't go off down side tangents, incredibly important though they may be, particularly regarding environmental concerns? And what advice can Rosie and Richard give to campaigners starting out? I will keep us to time. We should be finished at 5 o'clock, I believe. I hope so, because I've actually got a work call at 15:15. But this should be fascinating. Please put your questions into the chat, and we'll get round to as many as we can afterwards in what will be a quick fire round. So Rosie and Richard, make sure you're ready for that. But to start with, just to set the scene, a garden community. Well, I first came across garden communities when I was at university. In fact, before that, when I was doing A-levels in geography. Ebenezer Howard and the Garden Cities, Letchworth Garden City, Welling Garden City, Milton Keynes, so on and so forth. And I know Rosie, because we did the same course at different times, would have done a similar introduction to them. Ebenezer Howard was back in the 1920s. However, it is still the major philosophy in terms of the way a lot of national planning is done. Question mark. Is it right to actually call these village, in inverted commas, or in your case, Rosie, a town, garden town? It was not a village by any definition. but is it right to call them garden communities and garden villages? Is it just a developer PR stunt? Is it the government trying to pull the wool over our eyes, or is it justified? So let me just start off with a question to both of you. How useful is the use of term garden community or garden village or garden town to the planning system? Let me start with Richard.
I suspect, I can't prove this, but I suspect somebody in what was then the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government was sitting there thinking, how on earth do we convince people that more houses is a good idea? So if we package them up in the most attractive way and present a sunlight type development 100 times over, we might get people to accept it. There's also, and this is somewhere where I have some sympathy, is that the cumulative effect of lots of small developments has a major impact on areas. And it's very difficult very often to actually accommodate or reasonably plan for increases in education and health and social infrastructure. And then if you build at scale, you can actually build those in a much more controllable, much more deliverable way. So I can understand some of the principles for going for scale and going for what they call garden communities, which have if they're built to TCPA standards, have certain basic requirements and targets to achieve. The problem really comes is that you can't deliver them unless you have the land, and you have the land at its base cost, not at its highly inflated greedy landowner, greedy developer cost. And that, I think Rosie will be able to say a lot more about in terms of viability of delivery, is that you find that the great concept, the great promise becomes very difficult to deliver because viability becomes a major issue because everyone's paying so much for everything. And that was certainly our experience here in Uttlesford. It was very difficult for anybody to be able to actually understand how these things were going to be delivered, because if you could do it the old-fashioned way, back immediately post-war, where you had development corporations that were set up, which were almost non-profit organisations. They bought the land at its nominal value. They drove the whole development. They decided the best place to put it. It wasn't simply there because a landowner wanted to make a profit, and that was all the way through my experience in planning, and it's not very long. It's because the major problems is that stuff is brought forward for the wrong reasons. It's brought forward because a landowner wants to make some money, or it's brought forward because a land promoter has managed to convince a farmer or a group of farmers that they can all make a fortune and retire. And the actual reasons why it's going in that location are secondary.
Fantastic, Richard. Thank you.
There we go.
Yeah, and let me, rather than the same question, Rosie, let me ask it a different way. So is a garden village or a garden community or a garden town just a master plan with a different name?
Yes, I think our councils wanted it to be more than that. And a lot of it stems from the Town and Country Planning Association, which has a very, very long history of promoting and supporting garden cities, and Ebenezer is kind of their great hero. So I think it is true that for some councils, they do see this as a different way of doing things, the better way of doing things. And as Richard said, you can, in theory, plan things much better and make sure they happen at the right time. But there is this major issue of funding them. And even the TCPA has not got to the bottom of that. So until you can fund them properly, the promises that anyone makes, doesn't matter whether it's a council, government or a developer, will never be delivered. And that's basically what we set out to prove throughout our sort of 5 years of campaigning, is that they kept making these amazing promises for a utopian future. But when you looked at the practical evidence behind those promises, none of them were deliverable.
Yeah, indeed, Rosie. Okay, and we're going to dig down now deeper into both Rosie and Richard's case studies. But before we go further, one of my pet hates is anachronisms and shortenings. What does that stand for? in terms of TPCA, please, Rosie, in case there's anyone on the call who doesn't know?
Yeah, Town and Country Planning Association.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Right, so you're in charge of the slides, Rosie, and I think it's you up first with the North Essex Garden Communities.
Yeah.
So
go on.
please just give everybody a very brief outline of how this came about, and then the key issues. I mean, we've not got time to deal with them all today, but the key issues that you confronted and why you think you got the result you did. And I'll now shut up and let you eloquently tell us all of that.
Thanks, Simon. So yeah, North Essex Garden Communities, obviously in North Essex, came about because some landowners proposed some big sites, and it was at a time when government was talking about garden communities, and 3 councils of Tendring in the east, Colchester in the middle, and Braintree on the west got together and collaborated and said that they were going to produce not just 1 but 3 new towns. So the one on the right or in the east is known as Colchester Tendring Borders Garden Communities. The one in the middle was the one near Ish, to where I lived and grew up, and that's called, well, West Tay was its name, but it was known officially as Colchester Braintree Borders Garden Community, all very catchy. And then the other one on the west adjoins with Uttlesford, where Richard is, and that is the west of Braintree ones. They were from west to east, 13,000 homes, 24,000 homes, and up to 9,000 homes. And the theory was that these were going to be a new and different way of doing things. The infrastructure would be delivered first. There'd be lots of affordable housing, plenty of green space. They would be completely different from the bolt-on estates that we have at the moment. And in some ways, you can understand why the politicians got quite carried away with this. It did seem a solution. Conveniently, all of the blobs on the map are right at the edge of districts, and would have meant that the fewest possible councillors in the various ruling parties were exposed to them. There's a lot of sort of essentially dumping your houses in the far corners of your district, so that was quite useful for them. But anyway, so I was fighting the one in the middle, West Tay, as part of the campaign.
One question, Rosie, before you go on, is
Yep.
In terms of their location, how many local planning authorities, LPAs, were affected?
It's 3 local planning authorities, and Essex was also involved, and a funder later on, and then government was also funding through the garden communities programme as well. But three planning authorities working together. So credit to them. They did overcome lots of barriers. They did have a great system working together. So that was praised by the inspector, and it's right to see that cooperation was a good thing. But the problem is they decided very early on that they liked the sites the landowners had put forward, and at that point, right from the beginning of 2015, in the very first issues and options consultation, you could tell they'd already decided what they wanted. Nothing that anybody ever said would make them see that there were other options. We in fact put together a proposal. We got planning consultants, we got a transport consultant, planning consultant, a rail consultant, an urban designer, and said, take a map of North Essex, go away, come back and tell us what you would do if you had a blank slate. And they came up with this great transit-oriented development solution, which had no road-based unlocking, and lots of compact walkable settlements along an underused rail line. So we did have a suggestion that was far better than the one the councils have put together.
Rosie, a question, please.
Yep.
So these consultants, they cost money.
Yeah.
How much did that cost you, and how did you raise the money to pay for it?
So those particular consultants, one of them, Nicholas Falk of Urbed, who was the Wolfson Economics Prize winner in 2014, worked for us for free, which was amazing. And he had literally the year before won the prize. And the question was, how do you make a garden community something like sustainable, viable and deliverable? And his essay, which was the winning essay out of a lot, said you can't make a standalone community viable, deliverable or sustainable. So he is very much of the theory that you have to build them connected. They need to be properly on transport corridors, all that sort of thing, and close to urban centres. So he worked for us for free, and the others were at reduced rates, but we did have to fundraise. So we had a crowdfunding page, we did some quiz nights, and then we went around and saw a lot of people who we knew had deep pockets, and we asked them very nicely if they would cough up, and we were very lucky. We had some very, very generous donors. We had to raise over the 5 or 6 years, 120,000. So it was a big thing. Some of that you could argue was nice to have, so we didn't have to do the alternative, but it did make us much more credible with the inspector, because it meant we weren't just saying no, we were saying there's a really, really good, sensible solution here.
Yeah, with a professional, objective set of arguments.
Exactly. And
Okay.
actually, the councils ignored our alternative as much as they could, and were quite rude about it and quite scathing about it. And when I'm jumping ahead a bit, but when we got to first examination, the inspector in his letter, when he threw the 3 garden communities out, said that next time round, if they came back and tried again, they must take our option into account as one of the options they analysed. So it was definitely helpful to do.
Fantastic.
So they were all in the wrong place. They were all poorly connected. They were all going to have massive impacts on the infrastructure locally. They weren't funded properly. There were so many issues. So I was going to very briefly talk through 4 points about fighting the North Essex garden communities. So the first one was to say you have to take a big picture. You have to say, how has your council got this strategy? How have they come to it? Is it a good strategy in planning terms? You can't just say you don't like it, but is it a good strategy? You have to think about the impact on the local plan. These things take a very, very long time to build out, and you can assume roughly 250 houses per annum for a big one. They will take at least 4 to 5 years after the plan is adopted to get started. So that all needs to be brought in front of the inspector. And you have to say, have they looked at other strategies that might be more deliverable in the short term? You then have to focus very much on evidence and soundness, and not, again, that you don't like it. It doesn't matter whether you don't like it or don't like where it is. That's irrelevant to an inspector. So you have to become very, very obsessed with the 4 soundness tests in the National Planning Policy Framework, which are that a plan has to be positively prepared with a strategy that as a minimum seeks to meet the area's objectively assessed needs, informed by agreements with other authorities, and consistent with achieving sustainable development. It has to be justified, so an appropriate strategy, taking into account the reasonable alternatives and based on proportionate evidence. It must be effective, deliverable over the plan period, based on effective joint working and dealing with other issues rather than deferring them. And finally, it must be consistent with national policy to deliver sustainable developments in accordance with policies in the framework. So I know I've just read those out and that's quite boring, but it's so, so important. You absolutely have to get to know these, and everything you send in at any point, particularly at the last stage where you've got an inspector, has to hang on those 4 points.
So, Rosie, just to be clear, you're talking about the Reg 19 and examination phase, are you, at the moment?
I actually, do you know, with hindsight, I would have referred to these right from the beginning in all of the consultations, because probably the first one we wrote with the issues and options, we didn't know much, and we wrote some sensible arguments, but probably not with enough planning arguments to back them up. So no, with hindsight, I would write from the very beginning, I'd look at the NPPF and I'd go through paragraph by paragraph and go, doesn't meet that policy, doesn't meet that policy. And then, yes, right at the end, the Regulation 19 or the draft publication plan, yeah, you obsessively have to do it.
So your advice is to even do that before Regulation 18, even at the early initial stages when various sites are being put up for potential allocation. And
Definitely.
To do that, if you can, in cooperation with the planning development policy officers.
Ideally, exactly. Yes, we arranged several meetings with our all the local planners at all the different authorities, and raised our points, positive and less so. And we knew we were being ignored, but at least we felt we'd tried, and it also meant we could tell the inspector at the end that we had tried our hardest to engage with them.
And how important was it to have things like meeting minutes, etc., to then present to the inspector to show that you'd done that?
We did have meeting minutes. We kept everything minuted. We didn't probably use that so much for the inspector, but he did know that we tried, and I think he just trusted us on that. So the other really important document to get your heads around when you get to the final stage of the submission plan is the sustainability appraisal, and that has good legal weight. So that for us was one of the things that killed the garden communities first time round, and the inspector with that particularly pulled out that it wasn't objective, that the clarity of descriptions was poor, that the reasons for selecting options were poor and the reasonable alternatives were poor. So I won't say much about that now, but it's just so important. The sustainability appraisal has particularly heavy legal weighting, so don't forget that.
And I think, Rosie, probably worth emphasising at this stage, to remind everyone, we're talking about large garden village and large garden town community proposals. We're not talking about your normal 120 house application.
No, exactly, because that's exactly right. These will be very strategic sites, and so they have a huge impact on the local area, a huge impact on the plan itself. So the councils have to explain, well, first of all, they have to explain why they've chosen to go down the garden community route, full stop. Then they have to explain what sites they have assessed and why they've discounted other sites, and potentially why they've decided that they don't want to go for proportionate development of towns and villages instead. So the reasoning thing is really important.
Absolutely. Okay, if you can sort of just round this up for now, then because I'd like to move on to the Uttlesford garden community with Richard. So if you can just summarise where we're at the moment.
Yeah, I'll just 30 seconds on this hardwiring point. We kept being told by the councils that everything could come later. There'll be a development plan document later. Don't worry, it's all broad ideas now. And we were ruthless about saying, no, you have to prove it's justified and effective now. You can't pass it all down the road till later. You can't kick the can. So we said everything had to be hardwired in policy. So everything had to be set in stone in policy if they were going to work, although we thought they weren't going to work. So yeah, that's our hardwiring.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rosie. Summarising, what I'm aware of was years of incredible work and learning as you went through. Thank you very much for doing that in 10 minutes. That was great. Richard, moving across to yourself with the Uttlesford garden communities, and Rosie's there we go. She's brought it up already, so we've got the map there. Let me hand over to you, Richard.
Yes, thank you. I think one of the essential differences here was that our 3 garden communities form part of a local plan proposal. I mean, most of the housing was accommodated in these garden communities, but not all. So they were part of a local plan. If I remember rightly, Rosie's was a standalone garden community project, was it not?
Yeah.
Alongside local plans.
Correct. Yes, that's right.
Yeah. So the key thing with ours was, it came to inspection as a local plan, not as a garden community project per se, but in which there were these 3 garden communities. As Rosie pointed out earlier with hers, 2 of them were on boundaries. One there at Braintree, and part of that was being delivered as in the North Essex garden communities, and part of it was being delivered under the umbrella of the Uttlesford local plan. Then right up in the north, where I live, was the North Uttlesford garden community, which sits right on the Cambridgeshire border. And as it transpired, Cambridgeshire wanted nothing to do with it. They weren't at all interested, and the level of mutual cooperation was almost zero, which may explain one of the reasons why it failed. And then in the middle, and still kind of on the back burner, is Great Eastern, which is not far from Stansted Airport. And that's a big parcel of land owned by Land Securities, which they bought for a pittance years ago from the family that wanted to dispose of the Great Park, which Great Eastern is. And it's sitting there waiting to be developed, and it's a matter of great concern to the people who live there. I think if there was a killer takeaway from our experience, and bear in mind I was working only up here in in the north of the district in Great Chesterford, is that when you come to protest things and you want to stand against them, you've really got to focus down on what are going to be the killer issues. And they're what I would call the material planning considerations. And that's something I've learned from bitter experience in the planning committee, that you can get excited about all sorts of things, but only some of them will be genuinely material planning considerations and things that cannot be mitigated. And that's the key to it. Because landscape, for example, very rarely can that be mitigated. Landscape is a landscape. If you build all over it.
So Richard, could could you just give 2 or 3 examples of what are real material ones and those that can be mitigated against?
Okay, well, landscape is a key one. You know, you stick houses all over a landscape, you don't have the landscape anymore. So, you know, if there's high landscape value, then that's something to really focus in on. Archaeology is another, and heritage. You know, if you've got heritage assets and you've got very important archaeology and that sort of thing, they again, it's very difficult to mitigate them. If for example, you're getting very excited about education, then you can focus on that and make it an issue, but bear in mind that the local authority or the county authority can very easily step in and go, yeah, it's not going to be a problem because we're going to get X millions of pounds from the developers and we're going to build Y number of schools. So, you know, don't really bother us with that. So it doesn't mean you shouldn't look at it, but it's probably something that you will get argued against. Whereas the key things that can't be mitigated are the really important ones. And we were fortunate in that when we started this, we very quickly engaged the parish council of Great Chesterford, which has the benefit of having, I think, 3, maybe 4 legal people, barristers and solicitors, as parish councillors, which is enormously helpful because they have a certain mindset, an analytical approach, which is hugely helpful. And we soon thereafter, when it came towards the local plan inspection, we were able to engage a very talented lady in Chambers in London who has a really good track record. She's not a QC and she's not highly paid, but she's just very good, and she fought our corner extremely well.
So, Richard, was that at the actual examination?
Yes.
So I mean, you'd had to register yourself with Regulation 19 evidence. You then had to apply to the inspector to be heard. You know, you went through all of those processes. I just want to make sure everyone's aware that you can't just turn up and do it.
No, I mean, we made a very, very detailed response to Reg 18, and subsequently again supplementary in terms of the additional evidence that the local planning authority brought forward. We were in a strange situation, and I'm not sure whether this is applied elsewhere. It might have done. Is that our local plan was rushed through. The North Uttlesford Garden community was added at the very last minute, literally at the last minute, just before it was made public. And that was a very politically contrived thing to try and take the pressure off the south of the district, where the Conservative district councillors were getting very uptight. Well, understandably, there was a lot of pressure for them from their residents. So we had this one dropped on us up in the north, very, very unexpectedly. It was completely out of the blue, with very little evidence behind it. The evidence was drip fed to us all the way through, and then assumptions were made at Reg 18, and then more evidence added prior to Reg 19, and even more after that. But we made a very, very detailed submission at 18 and supplementary at 19. Then we commissioned the Chambers in London, this lady Victoria, to take the case on, picking up on Rosie's point about fundraising. It cost us, I think, in the end, and not quite mates rates, but we were helped out. It cost us in excess of 50,000. Which we did through local fundraising events and all the usual sort of stuff.
Fantastic, Richard. I mean, again, this is over an extended period of time. So how many years?
Well, the plan came forward in, I'm trying to check my dates now, June 2017, I think it was. Right.
Yeah.
And it went before the inspector in February
2019, wasn't it?
Yeah, no, 2020. We had the local elections in 2019. It had gone to the inspector, submitted. The submission was made in 2019. The inspector then wrote with various observations, one of which is, we don't think this stands the test. Would you care to take it away and rethink it? We then had elections, and The new administration was faced with the question of, do you withdraw it or do you continue with it? And for reasons I won't bore you with, that they chose to continue with it, if only to prove that it wasn't a sound local plan.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it had just been criticised by the opposition for dropping it. So it went forward then to actual public hearing in February 2020. And it went through the full, however many days it was, 18 days, I think. And then the inspectors wrote and said, as we suspected, and as we warned you, this doesn't stand scrutiny, and mainly because of the weaknesses surrounding the Great Chesterford, the North Uttlesford Garden Community proposal, and also because by that time, the one at Braintree, the one on the boundaries with Braintree District Council, that had fallen through, because by then we knew that North Essex Garden Communities was pretty much a dead duck. So you know, the inspector was saying, well, that's not going to deliver, and we don't believe you can deliver North Essex Garden Communities. So what are you going to do?
So some clear messages are coming out from both of you here. I mean, one is sustainability, one is soundness, and the third is deliverability, which are three areas in which campaigners can objectively, within planning policy, put together strong cases. That's the first thing. I know there are some questions coming in about Reg 18, Reg 19 examination. You know, we haven't got time today to go into the whole local plan process. There is a fantastic webinar that we've already held on local plans, which if Marge can put the YouTube link to that would be useful, but for people to look at later. But the key for me is, again, to come back to the fact that these are garden communities, garden villages, garden towns, whatever. In Rosie, in your case, almost a garden city, I think. Yeah. Did the local plans fail because the developers, through their misguided strategic choices, as we know in retrospect, decided to go for the garden community option as a so-called simple solution? I mean, in your case, Richard, you said this was all part of the local plan. In Rosie's case, it's alongside the local plan. What has it turned out for them to be a bad choice?
Definitely for ours. The issue with ours is they got very overexcited, very carried away. They became vanity projects. There was talk of forming a new development corporation under the new legislation, which allows it to be locally led by the councils. They set up a delivery vehicle ready to be that development corporation. They spent about £8 million through that delivery vehicle. They did their own evidence. So you had council evidence, you had delivery vehicle evidence, you had developer evidence, so you had... It got bigger and bigger and bigger. In fact, we joke because every time we complained about the size of West Hay, they added on another 5,000 houses. It just got bigger. So I just think they got carried away, and they sunk themselves. In our case, they were so big, they sunk themselves under their own weight because the infrastructure required was so vast. And all our research showed that the previous new towns were delivered by government, A, with the land costs at existing use, and B, with funding and support from government. So viability was a major factor in sinking ours. The infrastructure promises were simply not deliverable. So anyone else looking at any of these, make sure you ask for the infrastructure delivery plan, ask for the viability from the developers, and match the two together, because what you'll find is there'll be lots of promises like schools first and, I don't know, new road junction first and sewage first, etc., etc. If you look at the timings we had, for example, with West Hay, they weren't going to bother building for 24,000 homes a new sewage plant. They were going to build a 13-kilometre pipeline to Colchester's sewage plant, which is already creaking and overflowing and yucky. But if you looked at the viability in one little box, it showed they weren't going to pay the money up front for the sewage pipeline. They were going to pay for it over 7 years in chunks, which just didn't even make sense. So you need to get into the real nitty-gritty of what are they actually going to do. And so the inspector slated the council's viability appraisals. He slated the delivery vehicles appraisals and the developers appraisals. They were all just based on thin air. Yeah. So yeah, really crucial one, that one.
I'll come to you in a second, Richard. Just quickly, Rosie, building on that. So on this, what would you do differently bit? You know, you learnt at the end of it that actually the developers, the strategic planners, even the councils got it wrong, and they, badly wrong.
Badly wrong. Yeah.
When you went into the process, did you assume that they knew it all and they were right? And how on earth are we ever going to overturn this?
Yeah, no, I very naively thought, oh, look, first of all, I thought, oh, they'll listen, because if we don't like it and we've pointed out there's some problems, they'll go, you're absolutely right, there are some problems, let's change tack. So that was my first naive moment. And then, yeah, I really did think, wow, these councils must know what they're doing, and their consultants must know what they're doing, and so must these huge developers. So, and actually, we all kept sort of having to ask each other, have we missed something here? That the reports were rubbish. I mean, I know lots of people listening here have seen rubbish reports, so it's not a surprise to anyone, but the appalling quality of these reports, you actually had to say, have we missed something here? What's going on? So no, lots of questioning ourselves.
Right. And Richard, and focusing in on that particular point, I mean, with your experience, were you in a similar position where you were very naive to start with?
Yes, most certainly. I knew absolutely nothing about planning at all, and even less about local government. So I basically, in leading the communication, the strategic part of the action group against North Essex Garden Community, I just basically drilled down and tried to find out what the initial motivation was. And what was very clear is it was entirely a political construct and a party political construct. So we dived straight into that, because that was the way of getting a very broad church of community behind objecting to this, because they could see that it wasn't a well-reasoned, a well-defendable project on their part. It was there as a political convenience. And I'll hold it up to the screen, but we actually developed this thing. Try to get it in focus. Is it in focus? No, it's not.
I think it's going to struggle, Richard.
It's a booklet. It's a booklet
Yep.
called Unanswered Questions, Home Truths, and Why You Should Say No. And it basically attacked the whole premise of where this project had come from. Where the story starts, why the numbers don't add up, the justification behind it, the misleading data that was being used to justify it, who, where, and why. And that was where we actually exposed all the landowners, named them, which caused an almighty furore. They thought they were behind some kind of sort of silent wall. And we then looked at infrastructure, which was roads and other things that either they couldn't deliver or that they were using. And this is the strange thing: they were using the most facile things as justification for doing it. And we were very quickly able to file a lot of those out of the water. Then we had to start looking, quite frankly, when we started to get ready for Reg 18. We then had to learn a lot about the nitty-gritty of the planning issues, and the sustainability appraisal, the transport infrastructure. Because if you look at the map, one of the reasons it was chosen, it sits up there very close to the M11 and close to the A11 that goes off into Norfolk, but it has no access to either of them. So that location was being used as a justification, but it had no advantage to it. It just funneled all the traffic down into the feeder roads that go up to those main arterial roads. And from an economic point of view, they couldn't afford to provide the links. That was the key to it. They were paying so much for the land, and there was so much other infrastructure needed. They couldn't afford to provide the transport links that would justify or actually make it an acceptable development.
Richard, do you know if the developers applied for a HIF, a housing infrastructure fund?
I
don't. I'm not even sure it existed then. Did it exist?
No, ours both did, actually. Ours all did. In fact, ours was ludicrous. They had one to facilitate West Hay, they applied to move the entire A12 to fit more houses in. They didn't even need to do that. That was the joke of it. They could fit the 24,000 houses in anyway. They've got a master plan from ACOM showing they could, but yet they wanted, and they actually succeeded in getting it, 272 million from government to move the A12, which infuriated everybody. And then the East Colchester one did succeed in getting a 90 million bid for a link road, which also isn't needed. And within that, there's some mass rapid transit money as well. So yeah.
I'm very conscious there have been some questions coming in, and there's some excellent ones in there which I'd very much like to make sure we cover. So we need to begin to terminate this part of the webinar. So,
Okay.
I'm also very conscious that I think we've got colleagues from Kent and Cirencester on, which is why I threw the HIF, the housing infrastructure funding question in. So thank you both for that.
Yeah,
so,
Simon, I think from our point of view,
yeah,
because it was thrown in at the last minute, there was just no
yeah.
backup to it at all.
Yeah.
And they probably would have done eventually, have applied for HIF, but it was like, look, it was literally back of a cigarette packet. Look, we're going to put 5,000 houses here. Isn't that wonderful?
Well, yes, absolutely. Thank you, Richard. That's useful. Very, very quickly. So how did you keep people focused on the planning issues rather than evangelical crusades for either non-material or less weight or mitigated areas of concern? Richard?
Yeah, it's a very good question, actually, because it's very difficult to get emotionally bound up in, we don't want this next to us, and what about the horses in my paddock, and what about the foxes that run across here? I think you really got to harness your resources, your people resources accordingly, and use them to their strengths. If you've got people in your community who are very excited about birds and animals and ecology and biodiversity, then get them organized and get them talking and campaigning about those issues. And if you've got people who are excited about education and health resources because they have, for example, children, then harness them as well. Through all of it, I think you have to be very aware, and both Rosie and I came a cropper on this, is that government decided to shoot the messenger rather than address the subject. So we got completely blasted as NIMBYs. It was the government's fallback strategy from the ministers down. We were all called NIMBYs. That failed eventually, because clearly we weren't, because we actually knew what we were talking about. But it is good to harness people's emotional excitement about it, but make sure it is focused and it doesn't fall into a sort of broadband, we don't want anything anywhere near us, because that will undermine your arguments.
Fantastic, Richard. And Rosie, the same question and a very short answer, please.
Yeah, no, to be honest, I would just agree with Richard. We split into groups that were focused on different things, and that played to different people's strengths. And the emotional side is brilliant to get people to come with you on social media and to encourage them to submit responses. So, yeah.
Okay, well, I feel a little bit like Paxman now on University Challenge. Here are your starters for 10. And this is a quick fire round, guys. So very quick. We've got just 12 minutes or so left. And I'm not going to do these in any specific order. So take them as they come. Richard is asking, could you comment on the advice and support they obtained from planning officers during the process? Rosie?
Yeah, we didn't get any advice or any support. They literally hated us. So we tried to talk to them, or we tried to work with them, but no, there was quite a lot of animosity towards the end. So that's an easy answer.
Yeah, and for you, Richard, of course, this has an added side to it, which I'm very aware of, is as a councillor, you actually work with officers. But
yes, and I have changed my view of officers actually since working with them. And also it's told me that you can work with them if you approach it the right way. But what tends to happen is the moment somebody gets a huge development dumped on their doorstep, it all becomes very adversarial, understandably. And if you can, try and knock on the door of the chief planning officer or the director of planning and sit down with them and explain your concerns and kind of lay out your demarcation lines and who can help whom how. It may be that at the end of the day you can't, but it's a good way of getting things started rather than turning up at the council offices with placards and banners and shouting and screaming. That achieves nothing.
Thank you, Richard. There's a request for references and links to the inspector's reports for the proposals in Essex. We'll do those offline and we'll get them up to the site. I think that's probably the best way to do that.
They're all on our website. So what I can do is I can stop sharing screen and I can put them in the chat because we don't
Thank
need.
you, Rosie.
Yeah.
So I'll focus on Richard now while you do that. So Marge has put up the link to the YouTube channel, which has the examination in public webinar, which I found absolutely fascinating. Somebody is asking, briefly explain the Reg 19 phase. Richard.
Oh gosh, I thought you might ask me that, and I can't remember the difference. Reg 18 is the initial public consultation.
Correct.
Asking for responses to the proposed local plan. Now, Reg 19, as I remember, is the final stage. It's when they bring forward the detail, and it's your last chance to have your say and to put evidence forward. And the evidence brought forward at that stage goes to the inspector. It must go to the inspector. It
can't be changed by the local planning authority, and it has to be regarding soundness and legality. You can't introduce new stuff. Okay, Rosie, I'll pass over that because I think we've just about done that one. Great question from Mel. Is 4,200 enough to count as a big enough size when it is through a housing infrastructure fund application? So is that big enough to become a garden village, garden town?
I think so. I think the criteria are very woolly. There was a government garden towns prospectus, and that had villages in one and towns in the other. And the HIF bids, you get more likelihood of winning if you put more houses in, because the whole way the formula works is about extracting maximum number of houses. All this strange formula and a stupid formula, but yeah, I think it will work. They'll be able to get it through, and I don't see why not at 4,200.
Yeah. Okay. Here's one, and Rosie and Richard, I certainly don't know the answer to this, so let's wait and see whether you can help, and we might actually need a legal person. Claire has asked, and I think this is fascinating, compulsory purchases have been talked about for 2 of the 19 landowners involved in their garden village on a green belt, and I'd love to see what the exceptional circumstances are to justify that. Is this allowed, or is it frowned on by the government inspector? Let's start with you, Rosie.
Okay, so compulsory purchase was a major discussion. We had at least 2 days of this. We had legal opinions. So what the councils wanted to do with us was to compulsory purchase the whole lot. They actually told us all they could buy it at existing use value. We knew that was rubbish, and it's another thing we had to keep pinching ourselves because we looked at the law and we saw it wasn't possible to do that. It's possible they could do it with those 2 remaining landowners, but they'll have to prove public interest to do that, which is a difficult one. B, if they do, they will have to pay them hope value, which means that if there's any, not for that particular scheme, but for any other development they might get on their land, they'll have to get paid that. Whatever happens, it will be very contentious and long and protracted and expensive, so it'll delay those proposals. So you can argue that if those landowners are holding out, then it will make the scheme much less deliverable because of those 2 landowners. So it is possible, but I think it's unlikely, because I can't see what the public interest is on that one. It's the private sector, unless it's a state delivered thing.
Thank you, Rosie. I'll have a comment on that as well in a minute, Claire. Richard, any views on the compulsory purchase side of things?
No, I've very little experience of it. I mean, in having looked at the evolution of the housing sort of market in Britain, you go back to the Land Compensation Act, which was, I think, 1961 or 1962. And that's where the problem started, because that built in hope value on any land sales. And as Rosie says, I mean, if it's a private thing, you're going to get very little support from government on the issue of compulsory purchase.
Okay. I mean, Claire, I can help you with 2 particular incidents where I've come across it. And not to mince my words, it was total developer bullshit and bluff, because they wanted to accelerate the sales through. And to Rosie's point, that issue about being in a public interest and also taking a long time to legalities. Any developer who's sensible, and I'm not sure how many are based on what we've just spent the last hour talking about, would consider it, to be honest with you. So I hope that helps. I think particularly because you've got Greenbelt, I think that's another major consideration regarding the exceptional circumstances. But I think take advice, maybe put a post thread up on the Facebook page, and I think you might find a number of people, and I'm thinking of particularly Julian, who's just managed to see off a fairly large development, may well have points to offer you on that. So I hope that helps, Claire, for now. But it is an interesting area. How do you deal with reasonable alternatives without dumping the housing on other communities? Yeah.
Shall I do that one?
Yeah, go for it, Rosie.
You don't have to do any dumping. You can basically, you can just say, look, these are the various strategies that could be considered, and you could just go through them. So you could go, look, you could spread all the houses amongst all the settlements in your district, and you can work out how many that would be. Or you could say, right, actually the towns should have more. Or you should say, if they've gone for one big settlement, why have they gone for one big settlement? Why haven't they gone for two smaller ones? Or why have they gone for one settlement where it is? Why haven't they gone for another one somewhere else? So you can do it without being location specific. You just have to look at the logic behind their decisions and the reasons for what they've chosen. And if you think there are other strategies, then you say those are the strategies that have been overlooked. So you can do it without dumping the housing. We did get some flack for our alternative strategy because people did feel they were being dumped on, even though actually we're just saying, look, it's a better strategy to illustrate the fact that councils haven't really got a strategy at all. So it is a risk.
Okay. And Richard, any thoughts on that one?
No, not really. It just brings me back to one of my hobby horses, which is the lack of regional planning. Right. When Cameron Osborne got rid of regional spatial strategies, that's trouble really started, because nobody's standing there going, here's a broad plan that makes sense.
Yeah,
it's all too fragmented.
Okay, we are coming towards the close, and I know some of you, we haven't answered your questions, for which we apologise. I think we'll try and put some of them up onto the Facebook page if we can. Richard, Rosie and myself will get together and see if we can do that. One, I think we will definitely put in, because I think, Richard, your point of view on this will be absolutely fascinating. It's the name is in the chat, but I'm not going to say the name out loud of the council. But a council somewhere in the Northwest Midlands area, planning officers actually approached landowners and suggested applications for a garden settlement would be looked on favourably. They were under party political pressure to do so. Richard.
That sounds very familiar, actually. Do you criticise that automatically? I mean, aside of the party political pressure, and assuming that there is no pecuniary interest involved anywhere in all of this, if it's purely, a strategic decision about where to put housing, it to some extent there's. I mean, I can put it this way: I have complained in our local plan development here, is that we only are only ever responding to call for sites applications. We never go out and look at locations and go, that would be a good place to put housing. Let's go and talk to the owners. Mm-hmm. Our local planning authority never does that. We only ever respond reactively to people who want to sell their land.
Well, they put out the call for sites normally if they've got any sense, but as you say, it can be a lot more proactive.
Well, if you people looking at the map of Uttlesford, Uttlesford's a very, very strange thing. It has one railway line that runs up the west side, and it has a motorway on the west side, and it has a almost motorway, a major A road along its southern boundary, and that's it.
Yeah.
So what tends to happen is that the housing has logically gathered around the most accessible parts of those main roads. But we also have several railway stations. Now, when you talk about sustainability of transport, it makes sense to put the housing close to railway stations.
Yep. Yep.
But at no point do we get any kind of strategic sense of a proactive go, right, there's land, it's by a railway station, let's go and consider that. We wait and see if a landowner comes forward, and if they don't, it doesn't happen.
Thank you, Richard. Rosie, could you please post in the chat the name of the Wolfson winner that you mentioned earlier? Fenella was asking for that. I mean, and just for me, I mean, I'd just like to add to that point, and then I'm afraid we'll have to close because the hour is up. But just to say that what the council officers did, approaching landowners and giving the tip the wink, of course it happens. And to Richard's point, sometimes it's quite valid. I think the problem we get is when it's done, and it's done by all political parties. It's nothing to do with a particular political party. Every administration would look at that, particularly in areas where they've got serious issues. And it may well be they're asking for social housing, real social housing, and rural affordability is another topic which I hope Rosie will go into at another stage. But yeah, never assume it's a conspiracy theory or it's being done for brown envelopes. It often isn't. Maybe sometimes it is, but we have to keep an open mind. But I think quite frankly, what we discovered today, and there's a question about it, and I think the gentleman is right who said it, is often the developers are ill prepared, do not have the evidence to support their arguments, and have very poorly thought through arguments. And I think today, Richard and Rosie have given us practical examples through years of experience and successfully fighting to community villages where that's been proven. And so on everyone's behalf, Richard, Rosie, thank you very, very much. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Please pass the word around about the Community Planning Alliance. It is doing a fantastic job, and happy birthday to it. 1 year old. And the fact that as an organisation, we are being discussed, and I know we are, at the House of Commons, in the ministry, by major lawyers and developers consultants, either as these people know what they're doing or, oh my God, these people are dangerous. I think it's a fantastic testament to what you've all achieved. So again, Richard, Rosie, thank you.
Yes, Simon, can I just reinforce something
you
said at the top of this, and I think it's very important. Just because somebody comes forward with a development of 5,000 or 10,000 houses, don't be intimidated by the scale. Don't be intimidated by the brashness and the coloured brochures and all the rest of it. They don't necessarily have all their ducks in a row, and you are perfectly entitled to question what they're doing.
Absolutely, Richard. So,
good way
Rosie,
to end.
Do you want to close with anything?
No, I'd just like to thank you for sharing it so well. And someone said, can we do this again? And I don't know whether they mean this topic, but yeah, there'll be lots more webinars, and we'll keep going.
Absolutely. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for everyone in the chat as well with all your questions.
Yeah, and some more we need to answer, which we will do.
Exactly. Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Simon. Richard.
Have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Okay.